Welcome back, my dear students. This is the seventh video 7 regarding the what we say about risk continuity, business continuity. And here we go to directly the risk identification and hazard assessments. What I want to say in this chapter is some points we want to focus on, some points here. Like, in order to effectively manage supply chain risk, you must first know what the risks are and fully understand their impact. So you have to understand where is the risk coming from and how its impact is. A hazard assessment or risk analysis or assessment is conducted to identify the potential threats to the organization, quantify the impact of those risks, core business functions, document the threats, and develop of an approach for eliminating what the course. This course is for eliminating and decreasing the impact of recognized threats. So all I will do is just to reduce the threats which comes to me from the external environment. So that's why I'm doing the risk analysis. Also, there are 3 key ways in which the results of the hazards, like you see here, assessment are used. Why? Or the ways I will use the risk hazards to identify, or by other meaning, why I do risk hazard or risk assessment, why I do risk assessment. So to identify the requiring the most immediate of extensive business continuity planning and act as a guide for prioritizing the order which risks are addressed. So to know more about the risk. Second, to provide basis for developing a mitigation program. So how to deal with the risk and how to mitigate the risk. Third, to provide a foundation for the business continuity planning process. Because we said, without assessing the risk, we won't be able to do a business continuity planning without assessing the risk. So the first thing is to assess the risk. Once we have identified and quantified the threats, it is then possible to determine how most effectively manage them. Conducting a hazard assessment does require some subjectivity and can never be totally accurate. Okay. The changing phase for supply chain risk. Supply chain have never been so sophisticated, it's a very difficult thing. Many supply chain threats are not local to an organization. Globalization had led to lower production costs resulting from cheap labor and materials. Add to this, mixed terrorist and threats also happen, the political situations, the unrest, the shutdowns, all these affect also and make economic also stability. Those all factors, we have to assess all of them for risk mitigation. Today, the situation is worse because manufacturing companies actually produce very little. Rather, they produce, they produce components and parts from multiple suppliers. And the multiple suppliers, even in the globalization, are from many companies as well. So it needs assembling in one country and distribution in many countries, creating a tremendous dependency on the supply network. That's, you want to tell me, the writer or the author, that all the systems now have interdependency, which means that the systems are depending upon each other. This results in having more eggs and fewer baskets. So we have more problems now to assess during the risk assessment. The effect of natural disasters also, that we have to assess the hazards based on the effect of the natural disasters. So, of course, organizations whose operations are solely within national borders are also not immune to changing disasters landscapes. So, the disasters are everywhere. So, if I didn't, the disaster did not affect me directly, but rather it would affect me indirectly as well. So, so I have to assess the risk. This is why I have to assess the risk. Okay. We have also the hurricanes and flooding, and this affect many countries. One of the examples, like the Hurricane Katrina that happened in the past history, it was one of the worst in the United States history. It destroys key shipping and halting infrastructures along the Gulf Coast from Florida to Texas, as you see here, from Florida to Texas. Rail and trucks routes were closed, budgets were severely damaged or destroyed, and bridges traffic was late. Also, one of these points is that the ports, such as New Orleans, one of the world's largest, were also impacted, leaving thousands of tons of goods and materials damaged or destroyed. That was in the Hurricane Katrina. Here, the Hurricane Katrina, this one. So also we have the other destructive record was about the Mississippi in 2008, which destroyed rail bridge, the floods or the flooding of the Mississippi, which destroyed the bridges and all this. So in all the cases, as management, you have to check out for the assessing, to assess the hazards. Like we say here, the immediate and ripple effects on companies along the Mississippi that are dependent on the river traffic to move goods were enormous. See, this is the effect, because companies which depend on the Mississippi River to shift goods was affected, and including increased shipping costs also. The shipping costs will increase. Once the shipping costs increase, the price of the products will be increased as a result of the necessity to rely more on truck transit. So here, start to depend on the truck transit and less on the intermodal delivery. Intermodal means using more intermodal. Intermodal means using more than one way of shipping. So I will use the trucks, I will use the trains, I will use ships. All these, call it intermodal, means depending on more than one mode of transportation for shipping the cargo in the logistic system. Delivery, and in some cases, everything length of closures of factories and other business to limit that it destroys some business, like he said here. Okay. Now we go to this part, hazard assessments and understanding threats from disasters. Of course, if the disasters or natural disasters cause like this, we saw flood in the Mississippi River, we saw hurricanes, and it will affect the logistic system. So we have to do a real assessment, a good assessment, make possible a more complete understanding of the threats that can impact the organization's ability to function as intended, and provide the framework within this organization. We know that things happen in some cases. What makes an emergency a disaster is not knowing exactly what is the severity or scope will be or when it will happen. So because about disasters, we don't have exact estimations. We don't have previous records on previous disasters. The impact of these disasters is not alike, is not the same. So expecting even these disasters is not always accurate. We don't depend here on about information about the past to assume the future, but even though it won't be accurate. Okay. So we must understand that in today's uncertain times, there will always be new disasters. Every day we are expecting tsunamis and this and that. Both new risks that were previously not considered as long known disasters create more damage and disruption than ever before. Okay. It's important to regularly revisit the planning process to update the hazard assessment to reflect new threats and change in the level of impact each threat will have an operation. So here we go. From the supply chain perspective, any event is a threat with the full potential to become a disaster if it results in significant disruption of transportation, loss of inventory, or the inability of suppliers to fulfill orders, the inability of organizations to fulfill orders, or the inability of communicate with customers, suppliers, transportation providers, or the stakeholders. So in the supply chain, it's not only its warehousing, transportation, all this, and we see that the disasters will affect a part of it or the total of it. Consequently, if one part is damaged, then the other parts of the same will be hurt. That's why we say that the effect will be on the total supply chain. We have also internal and external risk. Today, the risk increase, and the world is moving towards more and more risk. What about the hazard identification process? The first step in the hazard assessment, like you see here, is to identify all the risks, whether natural, such as hurricanes, earthquakes, and winter storms, or it was technological, such as engineering failure, equipment's failure, and power outage, or human causes, such as reasons of terrorism, cyber attack, on rights. None of us has perfect foresights. We never have exactly a best accurate. We never do that. And while the past is not always the best way of knowing what will happen in the future, it can help us identify potential disasters. However, we can still feel and know the natural result when we have tools now that will help us to forecast the upcoming earthquakes, hurricanes, but it's not accurate 100%. Look at the weather's example. Sometimes we hear in the weather that tomorrow it will be sunny and so on, and we are surprised when it's stormy and so on. So even the prediction about the future is always missing a part. Prediction about the future will never be accurate. So while hazards should be considered in a board context, you should try to identify events that may actually occur. Also, if your organization has facilities in different geographic locations, so if you have, as example, a warehousing here, and you have another center for selling there, and you have logistic system of transportation in another city or whatever. So always try to make a hazard assessment for each single part of your whole system. So for the part of, which is in the spot A, you have to assess the hazards for this part. The part of B, you have to assess the hazard of this part, and so on. So the same holds true for not so obvious nearby hazards. The same holds true for not so obvious nearby hazards. A gas refinery a major highway or railway used to transport hazardous materials, or business or government agency that may be the target for sabotage or terrorism can create a risk for your company simply due to proximity. So even if the hazard or the risk is not touching you directly, it might be touching by indirect way who is very close to you. So that means because like a fire happened in the next building, that means I'm safe? No, it doesn't mean that I'm safe because this fire might come into my own building. This is the point. In short, all supply chain risk should be included in your assessment. So don't leave anything. All the risk, you have to include it in your own assessment. Problems also, event that might be indicator that warn that a disaster may occur either in the future or under slightly different circumstances need also to be identified. The problems, like here, we say the problems need to be identified. Okay. These late deliveries are problems as example. So if I have a supply and this supply now it's repeated that he delivered me my goods late than time. And this also occur or happened frequently now, that he's always late. He is not shown up in time. He didn't deliver me the raw materials or things which I need as a supplier. He did not provide it to me or supply me with it within the time, limits or with the time due, but later on. And this problem also is repeated, not only for once, but it's repeated. So in that case, I have to look and assess this hazard. I will treat with it, I will assume it as it is a risk, and I have to deal with it as a risk because this late deliveries might cause me problems in the future. So all suppliers related risk should be identified and included in the risk hazard assessment. It's also important to collect information from multiple resources. Yes, here, to collect information from multiple resources. Different resources identify different sets of risks. That's true. Public safety officials and emergency agencies can provide valuable inputs and data. Yes, that's true. So you can take for assessing any kind of risk. The government agencies and government bodies reports might help also with the valuable information they give to make a good judgment about the risk or the hazards expected and so on. After identifying all the possible threats to your business, consider how likely it is that the threats will occur. Finally, and perhaps most important, consider should this event occur, what will be the impact? So you will say to yourself, like, what if analysis? So if this problem happens, if this hazard or risk happened, what am I supposed to do? What if this risk happened? We call it what if analysis. We call it what if analysis. So what if this problem happened? What am I going to do? What is the plan? So for that reason, we will put a plan or continuity plan. Okay, conducting a hazards assessment requires making some assumptions, such as the likelihood that an identified threat will actually occur, and doing some forecasting as well, because also that means that you have to do some forecasting. We'll come to a next point, that is mapping the supply chain. Like you see here, mapping the supply chain, mapping the supply chain. Like you see here, mapping the supply chain, mapping the supply chain. What about mapping the supply chain? Successfully managing supply chain hazards require a complete examination. So it needs examination, analysis, and understanding of your full supply chain, both internal and external. The flow of goods and services take advantage of both your own experience and knowledge and that of the other supply chain professional in your company. So to have a good image about the problems of the supply chain or the risk associated with your supply chain, make the decision when you try to take information, when you try to make a decision, make it based on the participation of all the departments, including the supply chain department. Let them be a participation. Let them participate in the decision making as well and in assessing the risk. The map process. What is the map process? Here is supply chain map. We have supplier, subcontractor, supplier, subcontractor, and they are here for the supplier and the key supplier and key contractor. And contractor suppliers here, they connected to the business partners. This will be heading in the primary facilities, and there is internal customer. And those will also reflect in the external customer, as you see. So the supply chain, first we map the supply chain like we did here. Then identify all the things that can go wrong, that will prevent delivering of the company's product or services with acceptable parameters. So use the standards to check out what will happen here, what will go wrong here. Okay, by using what-if analysis and checklist method. So we have two ways, what-if analysis and we have checklist method. Checklist method and what-if analysis will work, but will work basically on what-if analysis by brainstorming. In brainstorming, all the people of the supply chain management department will participate with their opinions and with their estimations regarding the expected risk. The checklist approach involves working with a list of hazards and identifying those of the list that are threats to your supply chain. This exercise will likely bring to mind other threats that are not on the list. A combination of the two may be even more effective. Next, identify all potential disasters and acceptable. Answer 3 questions. How likely is that the threat will occur? Has it happened in the past? If it does occur, what will be the impact on our operations? So you will see these are the points which you will assess about the hazard. For example, for a company located near a fault line in the San Francisco Bay Area, the probability of experiencing an earthquake was 50% or greater on the Richter scale. Richter scale might be rated. Here are the rates, like here is example, the likelihood or the probability, and here is the impact. And we see here some of them like very low here, because 2 is possible, which is very low, and the impact is very low. So it's here very low in this area, here low and here low. So it comes here the minor. The moderate is like high and also recurring. So it's recurring, gives high, and also moderate in the impact, and so on. A similar way to classify threats is to put them in categories based on the level of risk. So as example, I will put this on a scale of 0 to 10. So level 1 risk, that is limited in scope and impact. Level 2 risk is moderate in scope and impact. Level 3 risk, one that catastrophic, widespread in scope with long-term consequences. This is very dangerous one. So also, always when you assess the risk, you will put in your concern 2 points: the probability, how far it will occur, or the occurrence, like how many times it will happen, the chance to happen, okay, and the impact when it comes, how will be the effect of it. Impact on facilities and equipments is the third point. Impact on operations. So you will see, assess the hazard from these types of impact on those points. Another point we should care about when assessing the risk is avoiding the inherited risk. So what do we mean by avoiding inherited risk? Risk can be inherited from suppliers, contractors, and the companies to which we outsource. With today's trends or fewer suppliers, each become more important, and the ability of each to meet customers' requirement is increasingly vital. Okay. Now, to avoid the possibility of taking on unwanted inherited risk, it is essential to add consideration of the ability of these external suppliers to continue to meet obligation when faced with a disaster. So you will see them, if they are faced with a disaster, if those suppliers are faced with a disaster, what will happen? Well, there may be a misconception that sourcing transfer risks, outsourcing transfer risk, the actually is that outsourcing risk bring inherited risk and result in less direct control of managing those risks. Like you see here, the outsourcing can be a cause for the risk. By simple words, outsourcing can be a source for the risk. Easy or difficult, it may be to replace the supplier, vendor, outsourcer, or service provider should it be necessary. Yes, in case there is a risk that comes with from the supplier or inherited from the supplier, then it's better to change this supplier. Responsibility for supplier evaluation and selection is generally managed by the purchasing function. Okay. Now we'll go to applying the hazard assessment to develop a mitigation program. Again, applying the hazard assessment to develop a mitigation program. So one of the 4 elements of a comprehensive business continuity program mitigation is the ongoing action taken in advance of a destructive or disruptive event to reduce, avoid, and to protect against the impacts. So any risk choices can proactively, we have 3 choices here for proactive managing any risk or mitigate the risk. So the first point is to try to reduce the risk. Why we assess the risk? We assess the risk to mitigate it. Mitigate it means put it down. We cannot prevent it, but just to reduce the impact of the risk. Or transfer the risk through the insurance. This is with the insurance, like you see here, through the insurance. I transfer the risk, but like if I insure my company and happen anything, I insured my house and I had a policy to compensate me if something happened to this house. So once there is a fire or any problem happen to the house, there is risk, then the insurance company will compensate me. We call this transfer of the risk. Third, accept the risk by making a proactive decisions to absorb any resulting financial losses. A fourth alternate, though one that is not recommended, it is to ignore the risk, but this is a very bad solution. How you will ignore the risk? This is not game to ignore the risk. If you ignore the risk, that means you are careless, because ignoring the risk means that you allow problems to happen. You allow such a problems to happen of this risk. Going forward, now we'll go to this to know about this points is very important. Okay, let us say now, gaining a through understanding of the vulnerable and the related impact to the business providers provides information necessary for implementing appropriate mitigation strategies and lays the ground of for the development of a valuable and realistic business continuity program. So, hazard assessment is very important. If a hazard assessment means that you assess the risk, the future risk before it happened. So if hazard assessment was previously conducted, if we did this before, determine whether supply chain specific risk were included in the process. So if it was not included, if there was a pre-estimation or a good assess happened to the risk previously in the past, just don't take it as it is, because no one process will be valid and will be suitable or will be matching for all the events. Each event happen of risk has its own impact. The severity and the probability are different. The only thing is that to make sure that the supply chain, was covered in this assessment, was not neglected in this assessment. Second, conduct a hazard assessment of the supply chain. Involve representatives of all supply chain business units. Third, link the results to the company's ability to produce and deliver its product or services. Fourth, identify possible low-cost mitigation measures that can be implemented immediately. So those are the points which we have to work on regarding the assessment of the risk and how to deal with it. And we saw here that there is two things: the frequency of the risk and the impact or the probability of the risk and the impact of this risk. We'll move now to another chapter that will be probably chapter 6. Shall leave you in peace now and see you in the next lecture. Thank you so much and have a wonderful day.